Thank you, everybody, for coming this morning. This is a presentation on postvention of suicide, but also information on a prevention tool that we rolled out in Charlotte County last fall, for intervening when there has been a successful suicide. Okay? The ripple picture I have here on the first screen represents what happens when there's a suicide. Picture a rock falling in the middle of a lake, and the ripples that occur that go all the way out to the edge of the lakes. That is essentially what happens to a community when there is a suicide. The most effect is at the center where the rock drops, and then it continues to ripple out through. So that's what this ripple effect is representing on this first slide. I want to introduce everybody to Mr. Donald Gould. This young man was born and raised in Michigan. He was a member of the Marines. After being discharged from the Marines, he started attending college. He was considered a music prodigy from the age of 3. His son was born in 1997. He had gotten married. And the sad part to this story is in 1998, his wife died of suicide. In Mr. Gould's own words, he says, "I lost it." And he turned to substances to start coping. By the year 2000, Mr. Gould had lost custody of his son. He had lost his home. He had lost his job. And he was estranged from his family. By the year 2015, Mr. Gould was homeless in Sarasota, Florida. And that was a picture of him in 2015. He was 51 years old. He was still using substances. He had not seen his son in 15 years. He had not seen his family in 15 years. Going back to him being a music prodigy, in 2015, during an arts event in downtown Sarasota where they had pianos placed throughout Main Street, someone videotaped him playing the piano. And he was playing a Styx song. And that video went viral. And as a result of that, there was some intervention put into place. He started getting treatment for substance abuse. He started receiving counseling. He reconnected with his son, who was now 18 years old. And he also reconnected with his family. He got a job playing the piano locally at a local establishment as a result. That same year, he was invited to play the national anthem at an NFL 49ers game. And this is a picture of him doing that. He received a recording contract with a company out of Texas. And this is Mr. Donald Gould today. That's the face of a delayed postvention after a suicide. It makes you wonder how his life might have been different had there been a more active postvention model in his community in 1998 that would have helped him after his wife's death. So in order to understand postvention, you need to understand suicide a little bit. And I'm going to go through some of the terms and some of the struggles survivors have. First, there's a big stigma that surrounds suicide. A lot of it is rooted in the historical laws of our nation. Historically, suicide was considered to be a crime. That's where the term committed suicide came from. To lessen the stigma, survivors prefer to hear died of suicide. You have to think of it in this way. We don't say somebody committed cancer, and we don't say somebody committed a heart attack. So we don't want to say somebody committed suicide. They died of suicide, just as somebody would die of cancer. They were struggling with things that they could no longer cope with. So that's one way that we can start reducing the stigma. But historically, when there was a suicide, property would be taken from the family of the survivors. Historically, family members might be imprisoned for blame because of being blamed. Historically, bodies were displayed in communities in shame after a suicide. The historical religious practices have always contributed to the stigma of suicide also. Historically, it was shameful to have a loved one die of suicide. And oftentimes, there was no memorial service. They were buried in the deep of night, and they weren't allowed to be buried in a cemetery. There was no memorial, like I said. So these are some of the deep, deep-rooted stigmas that surround suicide. So you take those historically. Survivors were left with no devices, no supports. They didn't want to talk about it. It was shameful. In fact, they often hid the fact that their loved one died of suicide. They would make up other reasons why that loved one died. When somebody dies of suicide, the survivors become a member of a club that they have no choice to belong to. And it's a club that will change their life forever. From that moment forward, their lives are changed forever. So when we're talking to somebody, especially a survivor, you want to use the terms that their loved one died of suicide rather than committed suicide. And that's the average, that's what is preferred in the survivors community. And you also, the important thing about postvention is you want to let the survivors know that they're not alone. They don't have to suffer alone. There's others out there who are a member of this unfortunate club. So we want to help them the best we can. So why is postvention needed? First, we look at preventing further tragedies and traumas to the surviving family members or friends. I once worked with a survivor, a young lady, whose mother had died of suicide. And the normal practices went on. They had the funeral, they had the memorial service, they had the burial for her mother. After everybody was going back to their normal life as usual, this young woman was left at home with her 2-year-old child. And of course, she had not been sleeping. She nodded off on the couch, and her 2-year-old fell in the pool and drowned. So these are the types of things that we want to try to prevent in our community. Stories like that. We want to connect them to services as early as possible, to let them know that they're not alone, and to try to reduce symptoms that they're struggling with, and to try to restore their functioning to the best of our ability so that their lives don't crumble as Mr. Gould's did, as you've seen at the beginning of the slideshow. As I mentioned, you want to maintain and restore their functioning. Some of the things that happen to survivors immediately is their sleep is disrupted. They begin to isolate. Their focus and concentration is poor. They experience flashbacks and blackouts. They have intrusive thoughts and intrusive visions, depending on what surrounded the death of their loved one. They'll have avoidance behaviors, anxiety, panic, hypervigilance. These are all, they can be all present, a few can be present, but these are the things that affect a survivor's functioning the most. Where does it affect their functioning? Their work, their family, the school, academics, the big areas of their life. It's hard for them to go back. A typical employer gives you 3 days off after a death. 3 days off is not enough for a survivor of suicide. I had a gentleman I worked with years ago as a survivor. His wife had died of suicide, and she had left a note. In her note, she blamed him because he worked too much. He was a self-employed fisherman in Sarasota, Florida. As a result of his guilt for that, he sold a very lucrative business, for a very, very low cost. Somebody got a steal, and as a result of that, he was unemployed, lost his house, couldn't find a job, and his life crumbled around him as a result of that guilt that note had left. Had we been able to intervene sooner, we might have been able to prevent that tragedy. The survivor's grief is complicated. Some of the symptoms I just named earlier, that identifies acute stress disorder, it identifies post-traumatic stress, it identifies depression, and a survivor can be experiencing all of those at the same time. What they go through is a roller coaster of emotions, and I'm just going to read off some of them. And they're in no particular order. Guilt, shame, loneliness, relief, numbness, shock, abandonment, blame, anger, feeling responsible, and a deep sadness, a very, very deep sadness. So these are some of the emotions that a survivor feels very soon after the death of a loved one to suicide. Initially they'll be in some shock, but those do start appearing, and they can be minute to minute. It's a roller coaster for survivors. So we want to provide support to them as soon as possible. The sooner the better. And the reason for that is because survivors have a higher rate of suicide themselves. They have a higher risk of depression. They have a higher risk of trauma reactions, the PTSD stuff. And unless they have good coping skills, they're going to resort to the substances or some other form of unhealthy coping with what they're experiencing. Wanted to give up some local data. They say for every suicide, there are 6 to 8 intimate survivors. Those are the people closest to the deceased. So these are some of the figures. You'll see in 2015 in Charlotte County, we had 37 deaths by suicide. Our neighboring 2 counties, DeSoto, we had 7. In Sarasota, we had 96. The provisional data right now from 2016 identifies that Charlotte County had 37, DeSoto had 8, and Sarasota County had 87, and again, that's very provisional. These numbers come directly from the ME's office in each county. It's reported to the state of Florida. And what you have to remember is, in these numbers, they don't include the one-car accidents into a tree. They don't include the one-car accidents into a wall, where they have to deem those accidents, but very likely could be suicides. The other ones they can't determine exactly are possible overdoses. Was it an accident or was it on purpose? So those numbers are typically not included in these. Nationally, suicide's the 10th leading cause of death. In Florida, it's the 9th. Charlotte County, it's the 13th leading cause of death. In DeSoto, it's the 8th leading cause of death. And in Sarasota, it's the 8th. Back to the intimate survivors. The average in the literature identifies 6 to 8 intimate survivors. Personally, I think that number's higher. We had an ROTC instructor in Bradenton, Florida a few years back. Got up in the morning, kissed his wife, kissed his kids goodbye, went to work, took his first class out on the drill field, lined them up, and pulled out a gun and shot himself. There was 30 children in that class that morning. So that one death alone, we had 30 survivors, intimate survivors who witnessed the incident. So depending on the incident, will determine how many survivors there are. So we want to look at the stages of grief of a survivor of suicide. The first stage is the crisis and acute stage. That's when the suicide is discovered. Law enforcement's on the scene. So we have the discovery of the body, of the death. We have law enforcement on the scene conducting an investigation. Often at this stage, the survivor or survivors don't even realize there's an investigation going on. They're investigating to ensure it's a suicide, not a homicide. Yellow tape goes up around their home, and they don't even realize this. They're possibly being tested to make sure there's no gun residue on their hands if a gun was used. And in this stage, the survivors are in such shock. Oftentimes, they don't even realize all of this is occurring while they're there. They're beginning to notify family and friends. And then we have to either clean up the scene or relocate, depending on what type of death it was. The hospitals are contacting them to ask them if a loved one can be an organ donor. They're making these big decisions, and this is typically within the first 12 to 24 hours. They're beginning to make funeral arrangements. I've heard it described by many survivors. It's like going to a wedding and a funeral at the same time, because they want to honor that person so much and dress up for them for the last time, and things like this, things they never expected. They have the funeral, the memorial, and then and through all of this, there's a large amount of support arriving for them. They're surrounded by people who love them. They're surrounded by people who are holding their hand and making them feel better. They're having to tell their children of the death, and a lot of survivors don't know what to tell their children. They don't know whether to tell them it was a suicide. They don't know how to tell them it was a suicide. And so that's often a problem there. But the biggest thing that starts very early on is the question why. And that continues throughout their healing process. And they'll continue to ask the question why until they don't have to ask it anymore. The next stage is the recovery stage. There's a short term and a long term. In the short term, and that's when we hope to get to them through our postvention efforts in Charlotte County, we want to get to them as quickly as possible to reduce the symptoms that are going to reduce their functioning. We want to get to them to educate them on suicide so that they can start to understand that it wasn't their fault and that they're not alone. We want to provide them with those skills as early as possible so that their life can be functioning better and they don't have to lose everything. What's happening during the short term is their support is all leaving. Their support is going back to their normal life. And oftentimes, this is when the survivor will start to hear, "Get over it. Why are you still talking about it?" And so they start to self-isolate themselves because people don't want to hear it anymore. They want to go back to their lives as normal. And that's oftentimes where the survivors get stuck. And that's when they start isolating themselves from family and friends. Slowly, during the short-term stage, their memory of the event starts to come back. They'll slowly start to realize that yellow tape was up around their house. They'll slowly remember seeing the gurney go out of the house or whatever the situations are. But the mind, I believe, protects them and only gives it in small doses. So the memory is slowly starting to come back. More of the symptoms are going to start occurring at this time during the recovery stage. They're going to be either appearing for the first time or intensifying because the shock of the death is now wearing off. And that usually happens within a month, 2 at the latest, after the death. If there was a weapon involved in the death, they're being notified by law enforcement that the investigation is complete, you can now come pick up the weapon. And what most survivors don't realize is when they pick up the weapon is in the same condition it was when it left the house. It has not been cleaned. It has not been, they're not prepared for that additional new shock. They're still continuing to ask the question why. They're being told to get over it. They're having to return to their obligations. They're having to return to their job. Friends are expecting them to return to life as normal. But what most friends and family don't realize about survivors of suicide is their life will never return to what it was before. So the law enforcement investigative report is being finalized. They're able to access that and read it. The medical examiner's report is being finalized. They're able to access that and read it. And all of these things are important to survivors for a lot of reasons. They're searching for the answer to why, and so they become their own investigators. They're looking for any shred of evidence to give them an explanation of why their loved one made that fatal choice. In the long term, as they have, triggers will continue to create symptoms to return, such as flashbacks or blackouts. And they'll continue, hopefully, to stay in some type of mental health services during this time to help them maneuver. But most importantly, during this stage, they're still continuing to have to process the death. Talk about it, explain it, try to understand it more, and that's when they need a safe place to be able to talk about it, where somebody's able and willing to listen to their story as many times as that survivor needs to tell the story, because most people are saying, get over it at this time. In the reconstruction stage, what they're really doing is searching and maneuvering and starting to basically re-identify themselves. They're having to find their new normal without their loved one in their life. So along with that comes anniversaries, birthdays, holidays, the anniversary of the death. These are all very, very difficult the first year. And so they have to find a new way to function with that loss. And that's often very difficult. Survivors often do not go back to some of the same things they enjoyed before. They find new avenues to live. Oftentimes, they go into volunteering and contributing their knowledge that they've learned throughout their experience to other survivors. And that's oftentimes the most healing thing for any survivor, is to be able to be there for the newly grieving, to let them know they're not alone. So when we have that knowledge, the Community Health Improvement Partnership, you've heard it called a CHIP in our community. We came up with a purple packet. And the purple packet, there's a couple of reasons it's purple. First, if you go to the National Lifeline, the national hotline number, their ribbon for survivors of suicide is purple. And then also, we wanted a color that will stand out if it's left in a survivor's home after a suicide death. So we want to think of suicide postvention as an intervention that will lead to prevention of further suicides or tragedies. Okay? The idea of postvention first came on the scene in the early 70s. It was actually by a Dr. Shridman in 1972. He wrote the preface to a book called Survivors of Suicide. And in that, he started introducing the idea that postvention could actually be an intervention to suicide. Postvention to suicide really didn't take off until the early 80s. That's when it really started taking a hold in our nation. And we started seeing some growth in the research of the survivors of suicide, data gathering, and stuff like this. And from that research, that still continues today, they do find that survivors of suicide are at risk of are more at risk of suicide. Historically, families with a history of suicide is one of the risk factors of a possible suicide that could occur in the family in later generations. And so postvention's primary purpose is to help the survivors return to their functioning and be with them until they find that new normal. Okay? So like I said, CHIP, through the Mental Health Subcommittee, we started talking about the importance of postvention in May of 2016. We got the idea from the state of Georgia. They already had a purple packet throughout the state of Georgia. And they had the program where, and it was actually run by their state Department of Health. And whenever statewide law enforcement would go on the scene of a suicide, they distributed this packet, and they also have it on their website. And so that's where the original idea came from. And then we decided to take that same packet and customize it to our county, to Charlotte County. The final versions we have created them in English, Creole, Spanish, and Russian. It was possible, the purple packets were possible through donations from the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention, the Inglewood Coalition, and we had an anonymous donor who also provided money for the purchase of the packets themselves. Okay? Since this slide was prepared, the word is growing throughout the state. We've had Monroe County, Florida, which is the Keys, contact us. They've requested a copy of our purple packet so that they could see what we're doing here. They heard about it down there, and they want to try to duplicate it in their county. We've had survivors ask for the packets. We've had Healthy Start distributing the packages. And we continue to have more people approaching as they're hearing about this packet and what it's doing in our community. And I did hear this past week that law enforcement has used it since we've distributed it to them. I don't know the details. So the intended distributors of the packet are our first responders. Law enforcement, EMS, fire department, and the AMP's office. When they go on the scene of a suicide, they've really become the de facto mental health counselor on that scene. And they often don't know what to do with the survivors who are there, their support system who is there. And so the purple packet has given them a tool to be able to initiate services right from that moment. We're looking at the secondary distributors of the packet in our community to be hospitals, emergency rooms, the clergy at the hospital, the funeral directors, clergy. Those are the people these are the types of agencies who will come into contact with survivors on a secondary basis. And then we go down to the schools, the colleges, the primary care physicians, mental health professionals, and other agencies in the county. And so that there's like a three-layer that we've tried to set up in our county. The first responders, the second layer is those likely to come in contact with them during that acute stage, and then the third layer, the agencies who are going to hear about the suicides and try to get this packet to the families. So let's talk about the contents of the packet itself, and I'll go over it if you want to look in yours. First, you'll see when you open it, there's a sticker on the right-hand side. It's from Charlotte County Public Schools. They've provided a number that families can contact in case of a suicide. Oftentimes, it's important to talk to the schools, to let the schools know this is what my child would like to see have happen when they return to school. They wish to talk about it, they don't wish to talk about it. And that's important to let the schools know that ahead of time for the ease of the child returning back to school. You'll notice there's a tissue in the packet. That's giving the survivor permission to cry. There's also the National Suicide Prevention business card very prominently on the left-hand side. When you look on the left-hand side, we've provided brochures from the mental health agencies in Charlotte County. I want to note that Charlotte Behavioral Health Care has set up a program for any survivors who contact our agency. We provide 5 no-cost therapy sessions for them right up front. And that's in hopes of, again, giving them the tools and the skills to maneuver through any of those symptoms that may be occurring and hopefully maintain or restore their functioning to some normalcy so that they can go back to work or back to school and this type of thing. After a suicide is a little brochure that the American Foundation for Suicide donated to us. It's just a really brief overview to the survivors, and it provides them a lot of information. There's a letter in there to the survivor of suicide, and it's signed by myself as a survivor, and it's signed by our former chairman of CHIP, but our CEO of Charlotte Behavioral Healthcare. And so that's a letter that we intend for the survivor specifically. The second page you'll see in there, it's titled Beyond Surviving, Suggestions for Survivors. Any survivor of suicide website you go to, you're going to see this exact same information. It was written, and it comes from the book, Suicide and Its Aftermath. And it's very popular, and it's duplicated a lot because it has a lot of good information to the survivors. And its intent is to let them know you're not alone and you can survive this. The other book that's in the packet is another resource that was donated by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. It's a financial guide to the survivors to give them a head start on, okay, this is what I got to do here, don't forget to do this, that type of thing. On the right-hand side is what we are hoping guides the survivor to not have any further tragedies in their family. We ask law enforcement or first responders when they're on the scene during that very, very acute stage. The survivor themselves, the most intimate survivors, are in such a state of shock that they're likely not to even hear you or understand you if you're handing them these packages. So what we've done is we've tried to train them to find one of their support system, the one who appears to be the strongest at that moment, and hand that to them and let them know there's information in here that's important. When you get a minute, read it, okay? And so that's what the pages on the right-hand side are attempting to do. The first one, when it says when to ask for help, it's educating them on the symptoms that they need to watch for in the survivors to know that they need to get help and to reach out for some help. And so that's what that first tab has tried to do. If you look on the back, we've identified again agencies that are available to help you. Okay? The second tab in the packet is specifically to their support system. How can you best help a survivor? A lot of people, even under a normal death, don't know what to do for somebody who's grieving. And so this gives them a lot of ideas, from something as simple as watering their plants and feeding their dogs, to going and picking up that weapon from law enforcement and taking it to a gun shop and seeing if they will put it on consignment for that survivor or something like that. Be willing to do this so that we don't have to re-traumatize and re-traumatize and re-traumatize this survivor. But that basically gives a long list of what you can best do. On the back, it gives some do's and don'ts when you're interacting with the survivors. And it has some very helpful information. It first off starts with, make sure you're using the term died of suicide. Use the loved one's name. A simple hug and the words I'm sorry is sometimes all they need to hear. They don't need a lot of conversation. Letting the survivor know that it's okay to cry. Discouraging the survivors from making very, very large decisions. Allowing them to talk about the incident over and over and over again. It's okay to tell a story of the loved one that they've lost, and to be patient with them. That repetition by the survivor is something to be expected. What they don't want to do is use the term committed suicide. They don't want to tell the survivor to get over it. They don't want to impose their thoughts, their feelings on the death upon the survivor. They don't want to blame the survivor or the victim, the loved one who has passed. They don't want to encourage secrecy around the death because that just promotes the stigma further. They don't want to discourage the survivor from exploring and investigating the death, because that's part of the healing process. That's part of that search of the answer why. They don't want to offer the survivor alcohol or drugs to feel better. They don't want to tell the survivor they know how they feel unless you are a survivor yourself. And you don't want to tell a survivor how they should be acting or how they should be feeling after the death of somebody to suicide. So that's just some, that tab is geared specifically towards the survivor's support system. The next one, avoid further trauma and tragedy, is some of the areas where further trauma, further tragedy could occur during that very acute stage after the death, such as the children. Make sure the children are being supervised. Make sure the pools are protected. How they can contact local gun stores who will take weapons on consignment so that the survivors don't have to handle them. Monitor the survivor's medication if they've been prescribed medication after the death, because oftentimes they don't realize how much they're taking. Make sure the animals are taken care of. Further trauma could be an animal escaping and losing their animal, or an animal being hit by a car. Driving the survivor. They're not in the state of mind to be able to drive themselves. I myself, as a survivor, ran out of gas. I forgot to fill up with gas. So, I mean, it can be something as simple as that to just inability to drive. Try not to try to deter them from making major decisions. And most importantly, be aware that we don't want to traumatize other family members by going in and cleaning up a scene themselves. On the back, we've listed Florida State Health Department approved agencies who will come in and do hazmat cleanup if the scene was violent. I've spoken to each of these agencies individually. Many of them, if it's a suicide, waive their fees, and they come out within 6 to 8 hours to do the cleanup. So what we don't want to do is re-traumatize any other family members or friends by going in and feeling that they have to clean up after a death. Most of the time, people do not realize that their home insurance covers that cost also. And if you rent, the insurance still will cover it. Just contact the landlord. Children. We've put a tab in here on how to inform children, how to help children cope with the death. What they encourage is to allow the child to make up their mind if they want to go to the funeral or not. And if they are going to go to the funeral, allow them to identify a way that they can be involved in the funeral, some little way that they can. And so this just kind of gives the parents a guide on how to inform the children and how to involve them if they do make the choice to go to the funeral, and not to force them to go if they don't wish to. The last two, the first one is designed directly towards prevention. We offer the risk factors and the warning signs to suicide, again, what to watch for. And then the last tab in the packet is called Healing and Finding Your New Normal. This gives all the resources in our state, like the memorial quilts, the Survivors Day in Tallahassee, local Out of the Darkness walks by American Foundation for Suicide, local support groups that they can attend after their initial therapy has completed. And so this gives them further services past, and this is looking at more of the long-term recovery type activities for the survivors. So that is what is included in our purple packet. The purple packet isn't new. It is being used in various states throughout the county. It was a little bit difficult to find some good stats, but one I was able to find was the Lost Team in Tarrant County, Texas. They kept stats from September 2014 to August 2015. Their purple packet is primarily designed the same way ours is, distributed by first responders and then the secondary and third, the follow-up groups after that. During that year, they had direct contact with 194 survivors. 99% of them received the purple packet. So out of those, 44% received the purple packet from law enforcement, 23% from the medical examiner, and the remaining were from mental health agencies and other agencies in their county. 74% of those that were contacted accessed services within 30 days or less. Cleanup of the scene was the biggest percentage of what services they accessed. 33% were engaged in group therapy, and 16% were engaged in individual therapy at that time. So, and these were all within 30 days or less. The LOST team started in Baton Rouge, Louisiana by Dr. Frank Campbell. He started it back in the early 80s, and he's really dedicated his life to suicide prevention and postvention. And so he designed the LOST team, and now he travels throughout the country, training counties on how to develop their own LOST team. And he trains them on what they call the active postvention model. They've kept some stats. From 1999 to 2008, the LOST team in Baton Rouge, Louisiana had direct contact with 1,411 survivors. Of those with contact, they initiated services within 39 days of that contact. The passive, the people who were not contacted, the survivors who were not contacted, the average initiation of services was 4.5 years. So that shows the significance of this early intervention. So like I've mentioned before, we're asking law enforcement to deliver the packet on the scene to a support member, or if there's not a support member present, to leave it prominently somewhere in the house. We've purposely not put labels on the outside of the package just to reduce stigma, and if the survivor, they will see it and they will open it eventually. We're asking law enforcement or the first responders to just briefly tell them what's in the packet. There's information on there on how you can get cleanup done. There's information in there on how to inform children and what to do about the funeral with children. There's information to you as their support system, and there's information in there on what symptoms to watch for to know that your loved one, the survivors of suicide, need to get some help. We ask law enforcement not to add or take away from the package, to leave to leave it intact as it is. And then when we have been out training, we've asked the secondary and all the follow-ups past the first responders, when they come into somebody who is a survivor of suicide, to just ask them, have you received the purple packet that we have here in this county? And if they haven't, provide them one. So what are we going to be doing in the future in Charlotte County with our postvention? There's work in progress to start including all the contents of our purple package on websites. The County Health Department, Charlotte Behavioral, other mental health agencies to have access to them. We have begun our own data gathering on the distribution and what services are being contacted, what services are being initiated. And so that's some of the things we're going to be working on now that we've rolled out the purple packet in our county. So there's a feedback form that you got when you picked up. We're asking that you complete that. It helps us to understand. And this is old information. This was, we did roll out and physically deliver the packets to all of our first responders on October 14th. And they began using them immediately. And so we are up and running with this postvention model in Charlotte County at this time. And that's it. And I do know I had one question. So
there was a time in which your voice got very low, and we were having a problem hearing what you were saying.
I'm sorry. I can go over the information with you again if you would like me to. How's that when we're done?
That's all right. I think we could probably That's all right. I think we got enough of it. It was just a little different.
Okay. Any other questions?
No, but as we used to travel around and speak to folks. suicide, absolutely. And we also said completed, because there are those that attempt suicide, and there are those that actually complete suicide.
Yes, what he said is they've also used the term completed suicide. And that's important because a lot of the times people who don't understand the term survivor of suicide, they assume that it's somebody who has attempted and survived. And so it's important that when we are speaking to a group that they understand what a survivor, when we're using the term survivor of suicide, that we mean these are the people left behind after a successful suicide. Yes, it's very important. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you know whether Charlotte County have anything in place that will prevent, helping people to prevent suicide? This is great for after outreach. But you know the schools that's teaching anything on suicide, since it is a pretty high rate here.
The question that was asked is, does Charlotte County have anything in place to try to prevent suicides? And the answer is yes. That's in addition to the postvention. We've also been doing a lot of work in Charlotte County as far as prevention. Last year we started a program in the middle schools where we went in and did signs of suicide training called Acknowledge, Care, and Tell. We were trying to teach the 7th graders how to acknowledge when a friend might be in trouble, how they need to show that they let their friend know that they care about them, and then we encourage them to go tell a trusted adult. ACT is what we do. We did that last year. This year we expanded it. We provided that to both 7th and 8th graders this year in the middle schools. We're hoping to be able to expand it more in the future. We've also been providing parenting nights for the high schools to educate the parents more on what to look for in their adolescence, what particular signs of trouble to be on the lookout to try to prevent suicides in that age group. And so those are a couple of the things that we've been doing as far as prevention in our community in the past couple of years, this committee. Chip. Anything else? Well, thank you for coming, everybody, and you have a great day, okay?